It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, Shadow Communities Secretary Steve Reid, the SNP's Deputy Leader at Westminster Kirsten Oswald and Annabel Denham from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today, Boris Johnson responds to the investigation into the funding of his flat makeover.
We will comply with whatever they want, and I don't think there's anything to see here or to worry about.
Northern Ireland's First Minister departs the political stage with this warning.
The future of unionism and Northern Ireland will not be found in division.
The Brexit deal may have cost her her job. Could it also imperil the union?
I'm not a thief. I'm not a fraudster. I'm an honest person.
Convictions quashed after the biggest miscarriage of justice in UK history. Will anybody be held responsible? And in search of the good life during lockdown. But what about the locals?
People like us who almost are getting pushed out of Cornwall because we can't find anywhere to live.
Let's start with the story across pretty well all the front pages, and that's over questions over who originally paid for the refurbishment of Boris Johnson's Downing Street flat. Let's take a look at one of them, the front page of the Daily Mail. Boris painted into a corner. Official probe into number 10 decor scandal. Johnson could be first Prime Minister interviewed under caution. This is reporting that the Electoral Commission has now launched an investigation looking into this issue of how the refurbishment was originally paid for, which we, of course, covered on the programme extensively yesterday. Let's have a look at the picture of this man, the government's new standards advisor, Lord Christopher Geidt. He's going to be looking into this issue of the Downing Street flat as well. He's a former private secretary to the Queen, and he was appointed yesterday as the new independent advisor on ministers' interests. The Daily Mirror has picked up this story. Also on its front page, Boris is the judge at own trial. Prime Minister has power to clear himself of wrongdoing over flat revamp. What they're referring to here is that the findings of the standards advisor are not binding. The Prime Minister can decide to overrule or ignore them if he wants to. So my opening question to all of you is, should the findings of the standards advisor be binding? Andrew?
Well, the rules are the rules, and I think it's very difficult to change the rules of the game when the game's already kicked off. It's clear the Prime Minister's made his position very clear. The investigation by the Electoral Commission is going to go ahead, and it'll be transparent and open. I think it's very unfortunate that we're on the eve of very important local elections, and we seem to be completely fixated by the Prime Minister's spouse's choice of soft furnishings when there's huge questions that we could be debating out there.
On that question, though, Steve, should the findings of the standard advisor be binding if, as Andrew said, those are how the rules are constituted in terms of that relationship with the advisor?
Of course they should be binding. Now, we've seen time and again with this Prime Minister that he can't be trusted to mark his own homework. It was less than a year ago that Robert Jenrick, the Communities Secretary, admitted breaking the law to do favours for a billionaire Conservative Party donor that helped him dodge £40 million in tax. The Prime Minister blocked an investigation into that for a breach of the ministerial code, just as he did with Priti Patel's bullying, just as he has done with Matt Hancock's family shareholdings and the access that was giving them to NHS contracts. Now, it increasingly seems the reason this Prime Minister won't point the finger at his colleagues is there are so many fingers pointing back at him. And if he is given the power to block investigations, then the whole system of integrity and standards in government collapses. And quite frankly, If the Prime Minister thinks the public don't give a monkeys in his terms about standards in government, that is simply wishful thinking by a Prime Minister who has no standards himself.
I will put some of that back to you, Andrew, in just a moment, but I just want to get the thoughts of the other panellists. Annabelle.
Well, I appreciate that there is some precedent and that's giving cause for concern, but I think it will be a lot more difficult to do if it's Boris Johnson that we're talking about. I think if the party decides that they don't want to ignore it, then he won't be able to. I'd just like to quickly pick up on something that Andrew said there. He was putting this against a backdrop of the local elections. I would put it against the knock-on effects of lockdown that are rippling across the nation. There is urgent work to do, and yet politicians are engaged in mudslinging over wallpaper. When the appropriate steps appear to have been taken, I find this quite shameful, and I think it will just serve to further erode public trust in politicians.
Right, is this mudslinging over wallpaper, Kirsten?
No, it's definitely not. And I have to take issue with Andrew's characterisation of that as well. This is not about the choice of wallpaper that somebody has made for the Prime Minister's home. This is about integrity. It's about transparency. It's about trust. And I think it's a really sorry tale, actually. It's very clear that the Prime Minister had every opportunity yesterday to answer questions. He chose not to. He was having a really hard time at PMQs because of that. So the obvious thing to do would have been to answer the questions, but he didn't, or he couldn't. Now, you know, there are clearly investigations that are going to take place. The Electoral Commission would not be investigating this lightly. Their own statements, I think, tell us what a serious matter they think that this is. And Boris Johnson needs to take these things more seriously. So, you know, he needs to treat this investigation with the utmost seriousness. He needs to respect investigations and the outcome of them also.
Right. As you say, these investigations and inquiries are now going to begin. The government has said there is transparency on that side. But, Andrew, the question that Steve raised is the track record of the government of ignoring the findings of the Standards Advisor. I mean, last year, just so that viewers are reminded, the previous advisor, Sir Alex Allen, found that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, had perpetrated bullying and broken the ministerial code, but was overruled by the Prime Minister. And then the advisor, rather than the Home Secretary, ended up resigning. Can't you see that that is a problem?
Well, I think it is a problem because that advisor who made that ruling carried out an investigation where he actually didn't ever interview Priti Patel herself to get her side of the story. That doesn't seem like a fair investigation to me, and I don't think it'll feel like a fair investigation
so what's the point of having a standards advisor and you just ignore their advice?
Well, the Electoral Commission themselves have dropped foul of their investigations. Have been deeply flawed for a number of years. They're another quango that's effectively dysfunctional, as far as I'm concerned. They've made some appalling rulings in the past, and they've been heavily criticised for it. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister's made his position clear. We're going to have an investigation. It will be transparent. The media and the opposition parties will demand that. But I do think it's a bit rich for them to claim the Nolan principles all for themselves when, you know, currently we've got the debacle around Nicola Sturgeon and what she knew and when she knew it in Scotland. We've got a Labour-controlled council in Liverpool that was so corrupt that only a few months ago it had to be taken under central control by the government. And we've got Liam Byrne, the Labour candidate for the mayoral West Midlands elections, who's been investigated for diverting monies now.
Hang on, Steve. Hang on, Steve. I mean, you're casting aspersions there on all your opposition and opponents. Can I just return to what you said about the Electoral Commission? Are you saying you don't actually trust them to carry out a thorough independent investigation?
Well, I think they've got a deeply flawed track record. How can you have an investigation into the Home Secretary's alleged bullying of staff when you don't actually interview the Home Secretary and get her side of the story?
Well, hang on, that was the standards. That was the standards advisor, not the Electoral Commission. When you answered my last question, just to clarify, you said you thought it was a flawed organisation. I think was your word about the Electoral Commission. So are you saying you doubt that they'll be able to?
Look at the investigation into what happened in Thanet South and my colleague Craig McKinley, and how that ended up.
Right. So yes,
that was absolutely unbelievable.
So you don't think they can carry out? They can't be trusted to carry out a fair investigation in your mind?
I think if you look at their track record, I think it's very, very dubious.
Steve, there is a constitutional issue. All right, you want to answer first of all what they said about Labour. Go on.
Well, no, what I wanted to say is the Prime Minister could easily clear this up. We were treated to a pantomime in Prime Minister's questions yesterday, where he repeatedly refused to answer the very simple question: who originally paid for the refurbishment?
Yeah, but
if he would tell us that,
we did this
whole
yesterday.
problem wouldn't be happening.
We did this yesterday, and we're now trying to talk about what is going on today and whether or not it's binding. Any decision or recommendation is binding on the new ethics advisor. I just want to pick up on your proposal, Labour's proposal, that it should be, because there is a constitutional issue, isn't there? Because our constitution works on the basis that Parliament decides who the Prime Minister is. It's whoever can command a majority in Parliament. And then the Prime Minister decides who his or her ministers are. Do you really want an advisor, in effect, with the power to sack the Prime Minister, regardless of what Parliament thinks?
I think any recommendation would be passed back to Parliament to decide what sanction was appropriate, actually. But there's always going to be a question about who polices the police. Nobody can be above the rules or above the law. You know, the police don't need a burglar's consent to investigate a robbery or a burglary. And the Prime Minister should not be able to block investigations into breaches of the ministerial code, not only by his senior ministers, but by himself. Because if you do that, you end up with government with no integrity, no respects for the rules and no standards. And that is not the kind of government that the people of the United Kingdom expect.
All right, we're going to move on. I'm going to point you to the front page here of the Belfast Telegraph. It says DUP in turmoil as Foster quits. This is, of course, the news that Arlene Foster announced her resignation as leader of the DUP and First Minister of Northern Ireland yesterday after a vote of no confidence. Let's talk to Emma Vardy, the BBC's Ireland correspondent. She's in Belfast. Emma, of course, we spoke to you yesterday morning and you said that Arlene Foster's leadership was hanging by a thread, and then indeed she quit yesterday afternoon. What does this tell us about the future direction of the DUP?
Well, it's been a pretty dramatic 24 hours, hasn't it? And it did look like there was sort of no way back for Arlene Foster. So when she came out with that statement last night, it was pretty much expected by then. Look, at the moment, the feeling is that whoever takes over as leader, their biggest issue really is the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Irish Sea border that's causing so much unhappiness, you know, in unionist and loyalist communities here. But they face exactly the same problems as Arlene Foster in that, look, that Northern Ireland Protocol is an international treaty. Those checks are already happening. It's not within the DUP's gift to get rid of them. What they can do, though, if the new leader decided to dig in even harder against the Irish Sea border, they could certainly make it more difficult to operate. For example, Edwin Poots' department, he's one of the front runners to perhaps become the new First Minister, the name being talked about. His department decided to halt the work on the new border control posts. So when the lorries come off the ferry, they get checked at the moment at temporary border control posts. His department are in charge of all that. They decided to halt the work amidst all the political wrangling over it. That's not making the EU very happy at all, because it was in the treaty, you're going to build new border control posts. So, you know, they can certainly make things more difficult. They can't get rid of it. The same problems that will face them as faced Arlene Foster. But a new leader could decide to take the party in a harder line and dig in even harder against those Brexit arrangements.
Right. Well, I mean, that's interesting. If they can't really change the Northern Ireland Protocol, and yet that was at the heart of much of the unhappiness and discontent, they could make it more difficult. But what about the relationship then with the government in Westminster?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make it particularly easy for Lord Frost when he's sitting across the table with the, you know, the EU to, beg your pardon, to discuss the way that the Irish Sea border is operating. It doesn't make it very easy when then you say, well, look, you've got a DUP minister running a department in Northern Ireland who's refusing to actually carry out what you promised to carry out. So it can place additional strain on that relationship between the UK and the EU. And here internally in Northern Ireland, don't forget there's 5 parties in a coalition at Stormont. You know, the other party, the nationalist parties, and those in the middle who actually say, look, we want the Irish Sea border to work. We recognise there's problems. We don't want to get rid of it completely. We just want to find pragmatic solutions. But if you have a DUP who are digging in really hard, making that really difficult, well, that starts to sort of antagonise the relationships with the nationalist parties in Stormont too. And as you know, as soon as you widen division there, running the whole country gets very difficult. So, you know, there's potential instability down the line. It all depends who this new leader is and exactly what tack they decide to take when it comes to the Brexit arrangements.
We'll let you go because I think a lot of people are trying to get in touch with you, as you say, on this dramatic day in Northern Ireland. Andrew, has Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, including the Northern Ireland Protocol, cost Arlene Foster her political career?
Well, I did raise my concerns with the Prime Minister when it was announced that we were going to pass in our Parliament in one day's debate the trade agreement and future partnership, when the EU were clearly going to debate it for many months. And what I raised with him was that these agreements, it's all about legal interpretation, and we know how we interpret the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it would be more interesting to see how the EU are going to interpret it. And if any legal agreement wasn't open to interpretation, we wouldn't need lawyers, would we? Because it'd be very clear what the legal situation was. Ultimately, I think we're being stitched up by the European Union, and it's had a very bad effect on the DUP, quite rightly. There's got to be a solution to this, and I'm delighted that Lord Frost has stopped on, because clearly we've got unfinished business with the European Union, and they might find that they need us rather more than they might want to in the future, once we've vaccinated and we've got massive supplies of vaccine which we can distribute around the world.
Right, but you're blaming the EU for their interpretation. Wasn't it always clear that there was going to be a problem with a border down the Irish Sea and checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland being at the heart of this, and Arlene Foster has taken the fall for it?
She has, and that is very unfortunate. But this is a situation that's going to have to be... The current position with the interpretation of the Northern Ireland Protocol is untenable. I mean, it says in the agreement they'll find pragmatic solutions, and you've got the joint committee that should be ruling on these matters. And it's clear that function of the trade agreement and the future partnership is not functioning. And that's down to a lack of goodwill on the EU side, who are clearly very bitter about the way that we've left the European Union, and they're upset with the fact that we're rolling out the vaccine programme far faster than they are, and they're getting the political backlash that they're not used to from their own populace in the EU.
Right, I'm going to open this up, but just finally, for now, Andrew, do you think this imperils the Union?
Well, clearly it's caused a lot of bad feeling in Northern Ireland. It's disrupting trade, and we can suspend the Northern Ireland Protocol because it's a disruptor to trade. That's in the agreement. And I think if this goes on much longer, that's where we're heading.
Right, that's what you think should happen. Annabelle, how do you see it when you look at what has unfolded with the Northern Ireland Protocol, the departure of Arlene Foster? What does it tell you about the future of the United Kingdom?
Well, I think in terms of what it means for both the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Union, then we need a degree of humility in trying to predict the future. Obviously, we are in a situation where Northern Ireland is trapped in the de facto EU customs area and has, in effect, remained in the EU single market for goods without any representation at EU level. This was inevitably going to cause problems, especially given Northern Ireland trade with Great Britain is vastly greater than it is with the Republic of Ireland or the EU. And we've obviously now got the situation where the EU has been slapping additional costs and formalities on the biggest part of Northern Ireland's external commerce. And I think we need to remember that it is actually in the bloc's best interest to make the Northern Ireland Protocol work. If they want Northern Ireland to vote to keep it, it will need to loosen up on the rules. And in terms of what we, the rest of the United Kingdom, can do, I think we've got to start focusing on East-West cooperation between Dublin and London. The Good Friday Agreement has 3 parts, and during negotiations, everyone was concerned about North-South cooperation to the exclusion of East-West. And I think it's vital now to rehabilitate the London-Dublin relationship.
Right. I mean, Kirsten, the Northern Ireland Protocol took years to negotiate. It's very controversial and, as we now know, difficult to implement. I mean, do you think that separating Scotland from the UK would, in a similar way, involve some very difficult decisions and compromises?
Undoubtedly, change comes with challenges. I don't think anyone would deny that. And, you know, I certainly wouldn't. But I have to say that sitting here and now, looking at the chaos in Westminster, looking at the casual way that Westminster deals with Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, I think that the case for independence in Scotland has never been clearer. I think that opportunity to have a different future where we're looking outward rather than being part of this inward-looking Brexit situation is something that is certainly enticing a lot of people to consider that there is a better way that Scotland could be running itself. And, you know, I do think that Brexit has really magnified the cracks that are already there within the Union. And this is one example, of the challenges that have arisen.
Andrew?
But there are many, many more.
Andrew?
I think the Scots are very canny people, as they would say. They can see the pitfalls of independence. Quite honestly, how anyone would want to swap representation in your parliament in Westminster to being ruled by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels is completely beyond me. And I think the stance of the SNP is extremely hypocritical.
Kirsten?
That doesn't really bear examination if you think about the way that people in Scotland vote. You know, this is a democratic issue. People in Scotland did not vote to leave the EU. There's not one single area in Scotland which voted to leave the EU, and yet we have had Brexit foisted upon us with all the challenges and difficulties that has caused for our communities. It's completely unacceptable. There's no good reason that people would find it palatable at all. And people in Scotland need to have the right to determine what their own future should be. So I can't understand why Andrew would actually have any difficulty with that concept. But I think that, you know, the thing that is very, very clear is that Westminster decides and Scotland gets what Westminster says, whether that's in terms of governments. Scotland hasn't voted for a Tory government since the 1950s, but that's what we have here. Whether it's in terms of Brexit, we did not vote for Brexit, and yet we have it. That is democratically unsustainable.
Steve, let's come back to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Labour voted for the Brexit deal, which of course includes the protocol. Was that a mistake?
Well, at that point, the only option left was leaving the EU with no deal at all, which would have been even worse. But at that very point, and in those debates, we were pointing to many of the problems with the way that the government and the Prime Minister had gone about this. And I suspect if Arlene Foster is reflecting on what's gone wrong, she must be regretting the trust that she placed in this Prime Minister when he made commitments to her, to the DUP, to the people of Northern Ireland and to the UK Parliament that he would never put a border down the Irish Sea. I seem to recall him saying that if anybody gave you additional forms to fill in to get goods from one side of the Irish Sea to the other, to come to him and he would get rid of them. None of that was the truth. The Prime Minister has, in fact, imposed a border down the Irish Sea, and it was him breaking his promises on that have provoked instability and broken trust between the communities over there. Now, it's absolutely imperative, I think, that we must maintain the Good Friday Agreement. It has brought peace to Northern Ireland for the last 23 years. Nothing can be done to jeopardise that. The Prime Minister said he had a means to resolve the dilemma of a UK-EU border without breaching the Good Friday Agreement, but it turns out he didn't.
Andrew, in response to breaking promises?
Where was Labour's criticism when the EU, who also said there would never be a hard border on the island of Ireland, actually announced that there would be one and had to withdraw it after about 6 hours due to the political criticism from around the world? I think that the EU have shown that they have very little regard. They've used Ireland relentlessly as a bargaining chip during the Brexit negotiations, and I think they care very little for stability and trade on the island of Ireland.
For 4 years, this issue was being raised in Parliament. How was the Prime Minister going to resolve the issue of having a UK-EU border, which effectively is in Ireland, without breaking the Good Friday Agreement that says there can be no hard border across the island of Ireland?
Well, Steve,
the Prime Minister said he had a magical scheme to fix that. He never told us what it was. The reason he didn't tell us what it was is because it doesn't exist. It was unicorns prancing around the paddock. And I'm afraid it's the Prime Minister's broken word on this that has got us into this problem.
Right. Steve, then, a question. Would a Labour government renegotiate the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Well, we're far away from the next general election.
Well, we may be,
right
but
now.
you've
This
been
has
very
to be-
critical. You've been very critical, and you set it out. That's fine. So, would a Labour government renegotiate
We
it?
can't have this going on for the next 2 years without being resolved. We're already seeing now the effects of the Prime Minister's broken promises and what that's doing to stability what that's doing to stability in Northern Ireland. I don't know what point we're going to be at in the next general election. Maybe it would have already been renegotiated by then. Because if we don't, then the government risks breaching the Good Friday Agreement and inflaming and reigniting all of the problems that exist in Northern Ireland. And that cannot be allowed to happen.
All right, we're going to leave it there and move on, because last Friday, 39 former post office workers finally saw their criminal convictions overturned by the Court of Appeal. They were wrongly convicted of stealing money. Some of them were imprisoned. And this is after the Post Office installed a flawed Horizon computer system. Now, it's being and is the most widespread miscarriage of justice in the UK's history, and the extent of which is not yet fully known. This is how Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, responded. Here's his tweet. I welcome the Court of Appeal's decision to overturn the convictions of 39 former sub-postmasters in the Horizon dispute, an appalling injustice which has had a devastating impact on these families for years. Lessons should and will be learnt to ensure this never happens again. And let's just hear from a former postmistress, Wendy Buffrey, and she's reacting to the successful appeal.
I know compensation is good. That's fantastic, and I'll welcome every bit of it. But for me, it was all about this. It was all about clearing my name. I'm not a thief. I'm not a fraudster. I'm an honest person, and that's it. That's everything I want.
Very heartbreaking for those people involved. Andrew, you've been campaigning on behalf of the postmasters for years. How did it first come to your attention?
Well, I was a newly elected MP in 2010. I was approached by two constituents who came to me with what appeared to be an unbelievable tale of woe, where they claimed that the Post Office had effectively victimised them, and they'd been falsely accused, they'd been convicted, they'd paid back money that they claimed they didn't owe and they hadn't taken. And I investigated it as a newly elected MP, and amazingly found that lots of other MPs were finding that previously pillars of their communities were being accused of theft by the Post Office. This is a very, very convoluted and very long tale, which we haven't got time to fully explore on this programme. But it is a huge miscarriage of justice.
Yes.
It's been very long running, and there's clearly been a 10-year at least cover-up by the Post Office themselves. And the disappointing thing is I have briefed every minister and cabinet ministers with this Post Office brief in their portfolio for the last 7 years. We've known that it's been a miscarriage of justice, and what we've seen is a systemic failure to, in my view, take the right actions to bring this quickly to a conclusion.
Right, but
and I want a full judge-led public inquiry to get to the facts, and I want an independent compensation panel to ensure that the victims of this, which are more than 39, it's probably over 700 who were criminally convicted, but on top of that, you've got thousands of sub-postmasters who were coerced and forced to pay back money they probably didn't owe. This is a huge issue.
It is.
And the current inquiry set up by the government has no powers to compel people to attend. I don't believe it has powers to force disclosure of documents. And the sub-postmasters themselves, the victims, have said they won't recognise it and they're not going to take part. So this is absolutely toothless.
No, and I know you feel very passionately about it, as do many others. But just to interject, you mentioned the ministers. You spoke to a whole legion of them, it sounds like. Why did no one do anything about it? Why has it taken so long? Did they not listen, these ministers?
Well, I thought they were listening, but they didn't take the correct action. And for that to have happened, for a minister to be given fairly conclusive evidence of a miscarriage of justice and for action not to be taken shows a systemic failure. And part of this public inquiry needs to be to find out why they didn't take the correct action, why they didn't take it seriously.
Right, so you would like it to look an inquiry, a judge-led inquiry, at the ministerial oversight?
absolutely. And there's huge failures in the management of the post office, and we can talk about that till the cows come home. But there's also a civil servant who sits on the board of the post office. And what we do know now is that in 2011, the post office knew there were failings with the system and carried on prosecuting sub-postmasters, standing up in court and saying that our system is Rolls-Royce, our computer system is bomb-proof, there is no errors in it. They knew at the time that that was false evidence, and that makes all of those convictions unsafe. That is a travesty of justice.
All right, we're going to move on. In next week's local elections, one issue for many voters is access to affordable housing. Greg Dawson has been to Cornwall, where the pandemic has brought particular pressures.
It is a county of two halves. For 4 million visitors a year, it's the destination of crystal clear waters, rugged coastline and rolling countryside. For 500,000 locals, Cornwall is simply home. But for many, the prospect of owning a home feels beyond them. Penzance in the far west has prices to compete with London, but wages here are below the national average. Well, it's undeniably picturesque, but for many locals there's a heavy price to pay, and they say they've given up on the idea of ever owning their own home because it can't compete with others coming into Cornwall and outbidding them for second homes. The issue now, they say, is that many can't afford to even rent. A 5-minute drive from the wealth of the waterfront, we've come to Trenear on the edge of Penzance, a neighbourhood recently designated as one of the UK's most deprived, a description the locals detest.
The judgmentalism of most deprived, it must be an area where people are bad or lazy or whatever. It's simply under-resourced and discriminated against.
Lizzie Sullivan runs Whole Again Communities, a project to help people eat healthy food. She says the number of locals being priced out of renting has been exacerbated by the growth of working from home, resulting in even more people from wealthier parts of the country moving here.
It's really quite scary. There are people who can easily afford to pay a down payment of 6 months. And even if there are properties available in the area, it's really, really difficult to earn enough money to be able to afford to live in them.
It's personal for Lizzie. One of those caught up in the problems is her own daughter. So we headed to Land's End to investigate. Yasmin lives with her boyfriend down this narrow alley in a converted barn.
This is by our front door where there's a crack from water damage.
It's small, it's got a damp problem, and it's more than £500 a month.
It's just so wet, and when you can see it, like, it's coming down your walls, and that's horrible, and you think, oh my God, I've got to wipe all this up, and I've got to do all this before I can even relax, and that's every day in the winter.
They want to move, but they're on a long list, and even if something comes up in their budget, they're being outbid.
There's just nothing out there. It's a bit of a frightening prospect, really, to think people that are on higher wages can come down here and say they've already got a home somewhere else, but they can come down, buy, rent something and just live down here happily. And actually, then there's people like us who almost are getting pushed out of Cornwall because we can't find anywhere to live. I've always lived in Cornwall. It's my home.
Cornwall has now overtaken London as the most searched-for location to live in the UK. House prices are up 13%, piling further pressure on the rental market. The council told us 17,000 households are on the waiting list for social housing, with an average of just 2,000 properties a year becoming available. Even the estate agents are buckling under the pressure.
I actually dread posting a listing. I try not to if I can. If we put one property up, we get 100 inquiries, so we're letting down 99 people.
Deborah Plowright runs a letting agents in Hale, just down the road from St Ives.
It feels like we're social workers at the moment because we get people phoning us in tears. The rental market is completely broken. The housing market is completely broken.
It's no surprise the issue of housing is front and centre of every party manifesto for next week's local elections. The Lib Dems, who currently control the council with independents, say they've delivered 1,000 homes to Cornish residents and will invest more than 200 million. Labour want a tax levy on second homes, with the money going to social housing. And the Tories, who are hoping to win control, want developers to commit to building as soon as they've bought up land. Here in St Ives, they've already tried something very different. Well, 5 years ago, locals here voted overwhelmingly in favour of a measure to stop second homeowners being able to buy new builds. They were hoping it might go some way to fixing the problem. They're worried now it's actually made things even worse.
A lot of local developers who we had dealings with actually have moved out of the town now. They've sort of either gone over to Hale, some have moved away up to Exeter. So a lot of developers now aren't actually building those new homes that possibly we need for the local buyers. If they are, they're still achieving astronomical numbers, which again the local people just can't afford.
There are few expectations that elections at council level could solve the problems here, but councillors will be left in no doubt as to what voters see as their main priority.
Greg Dawson reporting, and the full list of candidates standing in next week's election can be found online on Cornwall's council website. And for a roundup of everything you need to know about the elections, more information on who's being elected and what the elections mean for you, there is, of course, the BBC website or the BBC News app. Now, there were lots of things to discuss as a result of that. But, Steve, can I just bring you back to the opening thoughts? And this is about rents being pushed up. We can discuss second homes in a moment, but rents being pushed up in areas like Cornwall, exacerbated by lockdown to some extent and the pandemic. But do you have some sympathy that if you live in a cramped flat in Croydon, in your constituency, for example, that people there might want to spend some time outside London, outside the capital, go somewhere like Cornwall after being locked up for so long and rent there for a few months?
The two issues are linked, aren't they? Because if you get more people coming in from somewhere else into a particular locality where there's a limited supply of housing, it's going to push costs up. If they're coming to buy, it's going to push buying costs up. If they're coming and renting, it's going to push rental costs up. And it's absolutely not fair on the community and local people that are already living there that they are being priced out of their own area. Ultimately, that will kill those areas as places to live or as places to visit, so we can't allow it to happen. But I think if you look at what the government did during the pandemic to support the property market was introduce a stamp duty holiday on people that were buying a home. The mistake they made was in extending that to second home buyers because they effectively gave a £15,000 incentive to people to go and buy a second home. That's led, with the circumstances of the pandemic, to a huge flood of people, particularly going to places like Cornwall, and then forcing prices up so local people can't afford them in the way that we just heard.
Annabelle, go on, sorry, finish your point, Steve.
I was just going to say there's also an undersupply of affordable housing at social rent. So in the last year, just 6,500 homes for social rent were built. That compares to 33,000 in the final year of the last Labour government. So the two things go together. We have to not incentivise people buying second homes in areas where there are not enough homes for people who already live there.
Right.
But we also need to provide more social housing that people can afford to rent.
Right, and politicians always make these promises. I know I want to talk about rents being pushed up, but first of all, just to address the issue of the Chancellor's stamp duty holiday applying to second homes, was that a mistake, Annabelle?
No, I don't think so. I think when it comes to the topic of second homes, many, as Steve has just done, immediately put forward the case of restricting the welfare of others instead of addressing the root of the issue, that there are not enough homes for those living in these communities. We have a housing crisis in this country that successive governments have failed to tackle. They intervene in the housing market in ways that drive up the demand, drive up prices, while doing absolutely nothing to increase supply. It's pressingly urgent that we liberalise planning, that we selectively reclassify green belt land where housing is most needed, and that we revise and reverse tax distortions such as stamp duty that serve to gum up not just the housing market but the labour market as well.
Right. Andrew, do you have a problem in principle with people having second homes?
No, I don't. I think people do have the choice, but I think what we need to do is, well, all this comes back to the fact that we have got still a major shortfall in the number of houses on the market and the number of houses being built. In my constituency, we've been building 1,000 new houses a year, and they're selling, and we've got a vested interest. I've got 3 of the largest brick factories in the country within my constituency. But I think we've got to encourage house building nationally, but I think we've also got to allow local authorities to address their local issues and give them the powers, whether that's putting up council tax on second homes, Maybe there's something we can do with stamp duty. I'd like to see stamp duty abolished for first homes and only imposed for second homes. There are lots of measures, but I think it's got to be more leeway for local authorities to address their local issues. But ultimately, we've got to build more houses.
I mean, Kirsten, do you have sympathy for people who wanted to strike out of cities and go to the countryside, beautiful parts of Scotland for a few months? Now we're coming out of the pandemic.
I mean, I think that we can all appreciate why people might want to be somewhere that looks beautiful and, you know, that might give them opportunities to get out and about. But I think before we focus too much on people's desire for second homes, we really need to think about people's first homes. I think that has to be the priority. And the SNP in Scotland have got great things to say about housing. We've got a fantastic record on housing. We've built nearly 100,000 affordable homes.
Right, but before, hang on, Kirsten, I don't want to have a sort of long list of numbers because the viewers can't really see. But I want to keep it on the second home issue because the SNP are considering imposing restrictions on second home ownership because of the problems we've been discussing. Will you?
But I think that the point really is that people need to have a first home rather than us focusing.
I hear that, but that's what this discussion is about. Now, are you considering imposing restrictions?
I understand that, and I think in areas like the Highlands and Islands, for instance, in Scotland, which is, of course, absolutely beautiful,
yes,
there have been more people who've been keen to go there, and whilst that is understandable and welcome, we do need to make sure and to be very clear to make sure that people have the ability to have their own home first and foremost, and that's why it's important that we have the large number of houses that we have already built,
sure,
and a large number more. Can I go back to something that Steve said though? I was interested that Steve was so enthusiastically talking about the importance of house building and to make sure everybody has a home, which I absolutely agree with, and just gently point out to him that the last Labour government in Scotland built the grand total of 6 council houses. So yes, this is a discussion that we should have, and it's an important discussion in terms of, what we do, sure, and where we go with second homes. But we absolutely need to nail the first homes as the priority.
Right, and as we know, successive governments have failed to build enough houses, on which I think we can all agree broadly. Annabelle, market interventions, they may seem and feel very attractive in terms of trying to bring rents or house prices down. Do they work?
No, they don't. I find it quite astonishing that Andrew is talking about what needs to be done when the Conservatives have been in power for over a decade. In the last less than 50 years, in fact, the average house price has risen 4.5-fold after inflation. And this is a direct consequence of government intervention in the housing market. And things like Help to Buy are going to do nothing to solve that issue. And if I could just come back on something that Kirsten said about ensuring that people who are local to a particular area have access to the housing there. I cannot see why somebody from, say, London has less of a right to live in Cornwall or in Scotland, indeed, than someone who happens to be from there. I don't think that being local is an achievement, and it's not really clear to me why that should come with any privileges in the form of preferential claims on the local housing stock.
Kirsten?
Yeah, if I can come back on that, I think that one of the issues is, about privileges, if you like, and I think that it's very reasonable and perfectly understandable that people will want to have an adequate house of their own. That's something that I think that we should all aspire to for ourselves and for those around us. I don't think that that's something we should argue about. I think that it's also worth pointing out that in Scotland the SNP have put measures into place to protect people who rent. We have mitigated the bedroom tax. All of these matter because people need to have.
Okay, I need to get Steve in because we haven't got much time left. Steve, do you think market interventions? You've just heard what Annabelle has said. They don't work.
Well, Andrew and I think Annabelle earlier on were talking about liberalising the planning system. The government's proposals are that if you live in an area that is zoned for growth or renewal, local people will be gagged from being able to object to developments that are being proposed in their neighbourhood. Now, that is deeply unpopular everywhere. The problem isn't the planning system, actually. The problem is that there are nearly 1 million homes that already have consent to be built that have not been built. That's what we need to focus on.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back after the bank holiday on Tuesday at 12:15, and I hope you can join me then. Bye-bye.